Hi, I'm Len Diggins, and I am the host of this series called What's Sex Got to Do with It? And my guest is, or my fellow guest is Heather Remoff, the author, and the subtitle of the series?
Darwin, Love, Lust, and the Anthropocene.
Yes, quite the mouthful, and I could introduce the series a whole lot more, but what would be the point? Let's just get right into it. And unlike most series where you start at the very beginning, we're going to start at the end on this one, starting with the acknowledgements. And so, Heather, first off, I'm going to give you an opportunity. If there was anyone or any people that you left out of the acknowledgements that you wish were in, here's your chance.
I don't think so.
Okay.
Well, people like you, people who I met after the book was in place.
So,
I wish you were in the acknowledgements.
Yeah.
I've met other people since the book was written that have been very helpful to me.
If only could peer into the future. Well, hopefully, maybe that'll be something that we can.
I have other people who've been very helpful to me since the book was published.
Great. And I can kind of relate to your graduate school experience. Even though I didn't go to grad school myself, you went later. I kind of, to a certain extent, I spent a lot of time in a graduate school setting because I worked in the Lewington lab as a tech for a long time, and I really appreciated it. It seemed like it was kind of the environment that you had at Rutgers. Mm-hmm. It isn't so much that it was interdisciplinary as much as it was that it brought in a lot of people from different disciplines. So in that sense, it was interdisciplinary, but it wasn't like it was a couple of labs from different disciplines that were connected. It was more that Richard Lewington attracted a lot of different people, and so my period of time there was really a wonderful period of time. And so you mentioned Lionel and Robin. They were like the directors there?
They were at Rutgers. They were my mentors. I feel so lucky. I was very naive when I was younger. I guess in some ways I still am. I just didn't realize there were things I couldn't do.
Right.
And, I did the standard thing of getting my undergraduate degree, but that was in sociology. And, the first thing I learned in sociology, my first professor said the underlying premise of sociology is that all behavior is learned. I did not believe that. I'd grown up around all kinds of animals. I knew that all behavior was not learned within different breeds of sheep or pigs or dogs. Behavior, you could predict it based on the breed. But I went through 3.5 years of undergraduate school pretending I believed that because I wanted to get good grades. And then I did the standard thing, got married, had kids, etc. And I was living in Kansas City, and a friend started lending me books written by an author who was talking about the evolution of behavior. And I thought, wow, Robert Ardrey, maybe the field of sociology is ready for me now. And so University of Missouri at Kansas City was a short drive for me. So I enrolled for a master's in sociology, thinking, finally sociology is ready to look at behavior, the link between behavior and biology. And at my first graduate level class at UMKC, the professor said, now the underlying premise of sociology is that all behavior is learned. I thought, oh no, they're still not ready for me, but they were. That was a night school, and I really didn't, have a lot of connection with my fellow students and professors. But that department allowed me to do my master's thesis on the relationship between a woman's rank in an all-female hierarchy and her testosterone levels. And the endocrinologist, we drew blood to test it. The endocrinologist I worked with was stunned. I was expecting a positive correlation. I had 3 groups of women, and I got perfect negative correlation in 2 of the groups and a strong negative correlation in the 3rd. So it was that research that Lionel Tiger and Robin Fox were interested in at Rutgers. And again, I never wanted to be an academic. I always wanted to be a writer. the only time both times for my master's and my PhD, I went back to school when there were questions I wanted to answer, was curious about, and I couldn't find the answers in books. And so once I had my master's thesis, I was really suddenly excited. Wow, there is a link between biology and behavior. And then I read a book by Lionel Tiger and Robin Fox, The Imperial Animal. And they were also talking about the link between biology and behavior. It was in the early days of sociobiology. So I thought, I want to study under those two men, because I have questions I want answered. And so I applied to Rutgers, and based on my master's thesis, I think that they felt I was a good fit for the program, because it was the early days of sociobiology. And, you know, I think one reason I connect with you, Len, and that you connected with my book is because you have some background in population genetics. And so you sort of get the kinds of things that drive my curiosity.
Yes. And the Linton lab was right underneath the E.O. Wilson lab, you know, at the Museum of Comparative Zoology. And as you know, E.O. Wilson was a big sociobiology researcher, and there's certainly some tension between the labs. But I hear where you're coming from, and certainly there is that connection. And I thank you for that history, because I was interested in understanding how you got into a graduate program and the motive for it, and I can certainly relate to the desire to want to learn things and answer questions, figure out stuff, and research environment is really a great place for doing that.
Well, one of the outside member of my dissertation committee was Robert Trivers, who at that time was at Harvard. And when I read a paper that he'd written on sexual selection in lizards, I thought, oh, this man gets it. I didn't realize these were important people, because again, I was naive, and I hopped in my little VW bug and drove from New Jersey up to Cambridge to ask Robert Trivers if he'd be the outside member on my dissertation committee. And at that point, he showed me through the labs, E.O. Wilson's lab and so forth, and it showed me the ants. But again, I didn't know to be excited about that. Now, I have to say that I really credit Bob Trivers with doing the research that was foundational to the whole discipline of what is now called evolutionary psychology, but that back then was called sociobiology. And his research is really foundational to that field. And so I was very, very lucky that he agreed to do that. And he was he more than anyone has influenced the way I think about the world.
Interesting. So yeah, that was actually one other person I wanted to talk about, because you mentioned that he was the first person that made you aware of our very human talent for self-deception and deceit. So that's an intense statement. So can you tell me more? So what is it? I hardly know the question to ask here. What is this talent that we have for self-deception and deceit?
It's a talent that's a bit of a double-edged sword. It's a talent that's based in our language ability. And of all the species that have ever evolved on this planet, there's only one that has symbolic communication, and that's humans. That's language. All species communicate. I happen to think that plants even communicate, but all species have systems of communication, but only humans have language. And it's through language that we employ self-deception and deceit. I mean, that is the source of our dubious ability to do that, because we're very good at lying to ourselves, convincing ourselves of the purity of our own motives. And then once we believe that, we're very, very good at convincing other people. And Bob Trivers actually has written several books in which he deals with that, but it was in personal conversation that he first made me aware of the concept.
That's interesting. So I mean, having read your book, I mean, I know what role language is going to play. And so his conclusion about humans being very good at self-deception and deceit is based on language.
I don't think he made it language as central a part of it as I do.
Okay.
I've come to understand the importance of language only since, I mean, I've always known language is important. Even when I was in graduate
Right.
school, there was speculation, well, what drove the evolution of human language? And
Right.
you know, there's all kinds of reasons that are
Right.
given. But it was not until I was here in Arlington. I moved here in 2008, and as I mentioned, I had a 20-year period where I kind of got lost in the field of economic activism. And it was only when I moved up here that my interest in evolutionary theory came roaring back because of Harvard, MIT, the Broad Institute,
Right.
Radcliffe, all these wonderful lectures that are made
Right.
available to us, to the public.
Right.
And suddenly I was so excited. And I have a friend who's a linguist.
Right.
And when she came to visit me from California, she said, "Oh, let's have a salon. We'll get a bunch of people and we'll talk about the evolution of language." She gave me a bunch of books to read prior to doing that. And suddenly, I'm seeing language is so central to everything that is human.
Right. But for Trivers, I mean, what was he basing the statement that humans are good at self-deception?
I think he was just aware that that's how humans behaved.
Gotcha.
I think he saw, I think he described it behaviorally and could see how it worked in terms of getting genes passed on. He definitely saw its importance in terms of evolutionary success, reproductive success,
Right.
you know, getting your genes into the genes of the next generation.
Right.
And since men and women, if you're looking at it biologically, might have competing ways to get to the same conclusion of getting their genes into the gene pool of the next generation, self-deception and deceit become important in that as well. So I think that was more his basis of
Gotcha.
it.
Gotcha. So, moving along in the acknowledgements, I mean, you mentioned James Tyrone Lane. You don't say much. You say he understands creative passion, and it's been a part of my life since he was 6 and I was 46.
Yeah.
You don't say much at all, but I'm intrigued, and I'll tell you why. First off, you don't say much. And secondly, we share a similar, we share the identical middle name. So now, now there's that connection to me. So now, kind of like, do you care to say more?
Well, you know, the reason I don't say more is because I want him to tell his own story.
Okay. All right.
But James, I am going to say more now because he's coming to Boston. This is going to make me cry. Oh, wow. I love him so much.
Yeah.
He's coming to Boston next week because he has a major role in the musical Ain't Too Proud,
Okay.
the Temptation show, and my family and I will be going in to see him perform.
Oh, wow.
But also I'll be meeting up with him, otherwise. But yeah, he was the most wonderful kid. I lived in Center City,
Right.
Philadelphia. And he went to the magnet school. There was a magnet elementary school just around the corner from me. And it was a school of performing arts, which is what he wanted to do. And he went to that school, but he played with a little boy who lived next door to me. And one day I hear knock, knock, knock on the door. And there are these two little kids. And they said, "Do you have some string and some paper cups? Because we want to make a telephone." I was all in. Okay. So next thing, these two little guys are there with paper cups and string, and they're talking to each other, and they're talking to me. And James and I have been talking to each other ever since. He's just an important person, an important person in my life. And although I was drawn to him because he was so adorably cute,
Right.
there was also some recognition, intellectual. We made an intellectual, a very, very strong intellectual connection. I don't know how else to describe it. I sort of recognized him as a kindred spirit. So even though I was maternal with him and protective of
Right.
him, we kind of connected at an intellectual and friendship level. One day we were riding bikes on Penn's Landing, and he said to me, Heather, don't you think we're funny friends? I said, I don't know. Why? And he said, well, you know, I'm a boy and you're a girl. So don't you think we're funny friends? I said, well, I don't know, not really. He said, well, you know, you're white and I'm black and I'm young and you're old. He said, don't you think we're funny friends? I said, well, I guess when you look at it that way, we are funny friends, but the main thing is we're friends.
Yeah.
And we were, and we always have been.
Well, that's great.
That's
great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's something about the age difference that made me key in on it because a friend of mine who actually worked at it was a museum of comparative zoology, and he was very much into crocodiles. And so he and his wife had a daughter, and so I started babysitting her from the time that she was 2 months old. And I babysit her at least like once a week. And so we developed a really good relationship. And so something about it made me think, I wonder if it's kind of a similar relationship. And even though it wasn't babysitting because he was older, it's still that kind of like, I imagine, kind of regular interaction where.
Yeah, and even when my late husband and I moved from Philadelphia, to a rural area of Pennsylvania, we stayed in touch, and he would come visit, and when he was in college, and then he, once he began auditioning for shows in New York, I knew he wasn't going to finish college because he's very talented.
Right.
And so he's very successful Broadway performer.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, I'm happy I asked, and that almost makes it the whole thing worthwhile. I'm certainly glad that we started at the end.
And particularly since Ain't Too Proud is coming to Boston next week, so I hope people go see the show. I think it'll be grand.
Excellent. So as you mentioned a couple of times already, you moved here. In 2008. Where were you right before you moved here?
We'd lived in Philadelphia for a while. We'd lived in Bernardsville, New Jersey for a while. We moved a lot. We moved here from Eaglesmere, Pennsylvania, which is a tiny little resort town on top of a mountain in north central Pennsylvania. Had 123 year-round residents and between 2,000 and 3,000 summer residents. We lived there year-round. And then from there, I moved up here. And as I said, once I moved up here, I just, evolutionary biology.
But what brought you here?
My late husband had been in business, a business executive, but he'd always wanted to teach. And so he took an early retirement to apply for teaching jobs, and he was hired at UMass Boston as an adjunct professor. And I have a daughter and a son-in-law and a granddaughter in Arlington, and so it was a no-brainer once he got offered that job.
So
that's what brought us up here. But it's the perfect spot for me now. I loved Eaglesmere when I was there. I wrote a book about how much I loved Eaglesmere. Yeah. But this is the perfect place for me now, and it just feels like this is so meant to be. I love this area. Love Arlington.
Well, that of course that warms my heart because I have a nice little role in the town. So it's good to hear that you like the town. Do you know what made you said you have a daughter, a son-in-law, and a grandson?
Here in Arlington, I have a daughter, a son-in-law, and a granddaughter. A granddaughter who's now in her first year at UNH.
Yeah. But do you know what made them come to Arlington?
Yeah, my daughter went to BU. She rode for BU. She was, and she fell in love with Boston. Yeah. And so she was very eager to come back. She stayed, actually, and worked in Boston after she graduated, then moved to Philadelphia, where she met the man she's now married to. And when John was looking for a job, they focused in on Boston, the Boston area.
Yeah, gotcha.
And they love it, too.
All right.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Now I remember the question. And this will probably be the last question. So you've written more than one book.
Yes.
Apparently.
Yes.
How many?
I can tell you, I've written many more than I've had published.
Yeah.
I can't stop writing. But the three that have been commercially published are this one, What's Sex Got to Do with It? My first book was called Sexual Selection. I'd called it Female Choice, Darwin's Theory of Female Choice in Sexual Selection. My publisher at E.P. Dutton changed it to Sexual Choice, cleverly figuring out that a book with sex in the title would get me on all the talk shows, which it did. So that was my first book. I turned my dissertation into a trade book, is essentially what I did. But my original editor, not E.P. Dutton, but a small publisher, had purchased it first and then sold it to E.P. Dutton. They edited out all the theory. And so that was left, I didn't have my evolutionary theory in there, my challenges to Darwin, my update of Darwin. So that was the first book, Sexual Choice. And then I tried to write some books on economics because I began to really see the connection between sexual selection and economic behavior. I did not get them published. Then I was diagnosed with a very, very serious cancer, and I thought, wow, if I'm going to write books, I better quit having so much fun in life. And I might not have time. And so I wrote a book called February Light, which was a memoir about the cancer years, and St. Martin's Press published that one. So I've only 3 that have been commercially published. I worked for someone who did sort of life histories of people and converted them to books. So I did that kind of ghostwriting for that gentleman. And then on my own, but if I count them up, I've written 13 books.
Well.
And I've really only had 3 commercially published. I don't totally count the ones that I did, as a ghostwriter. But 3 under my own name. But yeah, I've written 13. I probably shouldn't admit to that.
Oh no! I think that's great. I mean, personally. So how many were ghostwritten?
Well, the one that was ghostwritten that almost, became commercially published, that was the only complete book. The others were, the kinds of things where someone tells their life story, and then they just want a book for their family members. Those were.
But those that would deal with interesting, as I consider it, intellectual material, how many of those were unpublished?
Well, because I was having trouble getting, it is hard to challenge Darwin.
Yeah.
If people assume that I'm not interested in science.
Right.
And so I was having a lot of trouble when I would pitch nonfiction books. So I thought, I'll put these ideas in fiction books. I'll sell them that way. So I wrote a trilogy that had many of my ideas about evolution, sexual selection, and economics in that. It was a fantasy trilogy. I don't even read fantasy. The arrogance of writing that is hysterical. So I didn't get that published. And then since I've been in Boston before I wrote this book, I wrote near future science fiction that has a lot of my ideas. My nonfiction ideas disguised as fiction, which is not a good idea. But those books, the 4 attempts at fiction, I'm still very close to. The nonfiction books, one I called Out of England, and but I don't think they were so great.
Well, the fiction ones though sound interesting, So. And I'm intrigued. So the whole reason I'm driving at this is to say, have you considered making them available electronically? Like, you don't need to go through a publisher now, unless maybe you're thinking about still having them published. But I'm getting at it because I would love to read them.
Len, you're a brute for punishment. You really are. When I first met you and you said you were interested in seeing the cover design on my book, and we'd never, we were both attending a Zoom meeting, and you heard me offering it to show it to some of my buddies on the committee. And you said, "Oh, I'd like to see that too, Heather." And we chatted a bit before the meeting. I was, this man understands evolutionary biology. He understands genetics. And so, you read it in manuscript form. In terms of the fiction books, I'm such a dreamer. I think, if what sex got to do with it would become a big book, maybe someone would be interested in publishing my fantasy trilogy, because the same ideas are in there. I wrote that so long ago, and I look at it, I predicted so many of the things that have happened in terms of our politics and emphasis on wall building and so many of those things that have since come to pass.
You have got to get it published. You've got to get it published, you know. And so, and what I'm hoping is that in the attempt to try to get it published, I will get to be like one of your proofreaders, because I just really, I'm not a fantasy person either, but knowing where your whole like book is going, you know, and the concepts in it, especially the economic stuff, and now what you told me about it predicted, you know, because I mean, essentially prediction, I find it's not like I'm like a psychic and like I feel the future. It's more like you just kind of like say, okay, well you start here, and sequentially where do things go? I mean, probabilistically, you're not saying like I'm predicting it, but like probabilistically, this is what could happen. You know,
but
so,
I go back and I anticipated a lot of the environmental concerns that we had. But you know, Len, I wrote these thinking it was probably young adult. There's a romance, you know, that's the romance that drives the story. So I was kind of aiming at a young adult female audience. I don't know, but
you're saying so I probably wouldn't be interested.
I don't know. I don't know if you would be or not, because you know, I kind of buried the economic ideas. They're in there for me.
Right.
And my feeling was, I would hope that when young people would be finished reading that, they would think, wait, why couldn't that work for us now? And why couldn't we have that kind of a solution that would give us economic equality and would save the environment? Why? Because those were the two things I was concerned about even then. That was like 15 years ago. Still concerned about economic inequality and the environment.
Well, even if it wouldn't appeal to me because I'm not the demographic, and I'm fine with that. You know, I will say that one of the things I've been working on in town here is getting a youth and young adult advisory board for the town, and hopefully in this session of town meeting we're going to vote that in. It'll be called the Young Arlington Collaborative, and the whole premise of it is to get youth and young adults in town really thinking about how their government can work for them, getting them more involved in their local government. And so I mean a lot of them have ideas along these lines anyways, and I think it'd be great for them to be exposed to that more, if not through fiction, then through direct.
Just the idea of following your passion.
Yeah.
You know, we all have things that I think we all do. Dream something we believe in.
Right.
An idea that gets us out of bed in the morning.
Yeah.
I want to bring this to pass. I think I have an answer to something.
Yeah.
I want to have my voice heard.
Yeah.
And encouraging young people to believe in themselves.
Yeah.
I think that's really important.
Yeah, because they are the future, and I certainly remember how much I valued having adults just listen to me and interact with me, and I think that's what what's his name?
James Tyrone Lane. He called, when he was little, I call him Rony. For Tyrone. He went by Tyrone when he was a little guy. And I asked him when we were talking on the phone the other day, I said, how would I even spell Rony? Because I am a bit dyslexic. He said, however you want to spell it, Heather. I said, well, do you mind if I, because when I'm feeling real affectionate toward him, I'll say, oh, Rony, that's exciting. And do you mind? Because my daughter will sometimes say to me, Mom, he goes by James now. I said, yeah, but I knew him when he was Tyrone.
Right. And funny, when I was growing up too, I went by Tyrone too.
Did you?
Because my mom gave me that. That was her favorite name for me. My first name is Len, as in Leonard. So we are way out of time.